Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, August 9th, 2024, coming to you as always from beautiful Madison, Wisconsin. And one of the things that has been on my mind lately, I've had as a topic once or twice in the past 2 weeks, is how the landscape of the presidential election for 2024 has shifted a good bit over the past month. It's first of all, of course, the late June debate performance of President Biden versus Donald Trump was a wake-up call to a lot of people who, after the State of the Union, thought perhaps Biden was, going to be okay. But then that shook a lot of people up, and rightly so. And then there was, of course, the great back and forth of trying to figure out how it is we could communicate it to him in a way that he would understand that we really, really, really were looking to maybe see if he'd be willing to substitute himself out. And it did finally happen where he decided that he was going to go ahead and give the nod to his VP, Kamala Harris, to go ahead and try to take Trump on in November. Well, thing is that Kamala has a relatively long background, politically speaking, in the state of California. With that in mind, I wanted to bring on a longtime friend of the show and personal friend, I'm glad to say, Peter B. Collins, who has been keeping track of Kamala for quite, I think, her more or less her entire political career. Peter, welcome back to TMI.
Aldous, it's always a pleasure to be with you, and nice to join you again today.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you. Now, as I understand it, Kamala Harris first caught your attention about 21 years ago, 2003 there in San Francisco. Is that right?
Yes, that's when she ran for district attorney, and she served 2 terms as the San Francisco DA. Then she ran for state attorney general, where she served 2 terms. And then when Barbara Boxer retired from the U.S. Senate, Kamala ran for her seat and handily won that. And most people know that she was an also ran presidential candidate who left the race before the end of 2019 without being on a ballot or receiving any votes. So I have a lot to say, some pro, some con. But Aldous, given the political climate, if you'll indulge me, I just want to tell people that despite some of the criticism that I'm going to offer about the vice president, I do support her as the substitute, as you pointed out, for Joe Biden. On any day of the week, she brings a lot more to the campaign and increases the prospects that Democrats can beat Donald Trump in November. It's by no means a sure bet. And it's going to be, I think, a very tough road ahead.
Oh, absolutely. Fair enough. One of the things that seems, at least to me, to be happening, and we'll see if it continues to go on this trajectory, is it does seem that my personal prediction, at least, in the idea that maybe we should substitute Biden out, may at least be accurate in as much as it seems that in doing so, we have wound up having a lot more enthusiasm behind the Democratic nominee at this time, which at the very least, that can't hurt.
Yes.
Have you been seeing the same?
Oh, indeed. Yeah, it's palpable. It's showing up in the polls, in online comments. People who were just kind of keeping quiet and hoping that Biden would limp to the finish line are, enthused. They are back in the game. The amount of individual contributions that she's received have been quite remarkable. And as one of the people who annoyed a lot of my friends and people in my, if you call it an influencer circle, I started talking about Biden stepping down in January. And I voted for Dean Phillips in the California primary in March. And I think it's important to let your viewers know, your listeners know, that I am not a Democrat. I left the Democratic Party in the late 90s when Bill Clinton was still president partly in reaction to what he did to the radio industry, where I made my living for most of my life. His deregulation bill was extremely harmful to radio as a medium, and it turned talk radio into an all right-wing propaganda system in this country. So I like people to understand I'm not a partisan Democrat. I would describe myself as to the left of the most of the mainstream Democratic Party. But like Bernie Sanders, I coalesce with and vote for Democrats on a pretty regular basis. That said, I was pleased that Biden finally took the hints and the pressure to heart and stepped out of the race. But I was pushing all along, not just for a different candidate, but for an open convention. And that clearly didn't happen. Nancy Pelosi, who now says that she didn't really push Biden out, but everybody knows she was the point person in that project. On the Thursday before Biden finally announced his intention, she laid out her plan. And Pelosi, who I know and who I worked for as a campaign advisor back in the mid-1990s, she, ever since she rose to the leadership, she's been running the Democratic National Conventions every 4 years. So on that Thursday before Biden announced, she said she wanted an open convention. She articulated a process where there would be a handful of candidates who might be picked by her and Obama and maybe a handful of other top Democrats. And then they would participate in town hall meetings across the country leading up to a convention where the nominee would be determined in a democratic way by the actual delegates. And this is unheard of. We have not allowed that process to go by the book for a long, long time. And I think it's disappointing. And I think that we would have had a stronger process and a stronger candidate, even if Harris emerged as the choice of the convention. But it was clear that the same people who were riding with Biden right up to the moment where he crashed his Corvette with the classified documents in the trunk and said, "I'm out of here," they pivoted on a dime. And they all fell in line behind Kamala, who grabbed the ring, Tolkien style. And she basically eclipsed any potential for a competitor. Everybody fell in line. And Aldous, there's this old saw that Democrats fall in love with a candidate and Republicans fall in line. Well, this year, Democrats did both. They fell in line and they fell in love, in some cases out of desperation to beat Donald Trump. And those stakes are extremely high. And even as I will share with you some criticism of Kamala Harris, the stakes are too high for people to sit it out. I have voted third party as a protest vote in the past. I'm not going to do that this year. RFK, the Central Park bear hunter, was off my radar from the get-go. I've met him, I've interviewed him, and I simply don't think he has the skill set, and his political positions are jumbled to a point where I could not support him. And I have voted for Jill Stein once, but the stakes are too high, the polls are too close, in my view, to do that this year. So let me take a moment here to go back in the history of Kamala Harris. Some of the criticisms I'm about to share with you are going to be surfaced by J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, and the media machine that they operate when the campaign funds aren't being used to pay legal defense for Donald Trump.
Well, yes,
Uh,
and allow me to interject really quickly that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure to have you on is not because I felt you were going to be discouraging people from necessarily supporting Harris versus supporting, say, Trump's ticket, but I felt that we wanted to get all of this out there as much as we could so we understood what we would be seeing. It's kind of an inoculation of sorts. We want to make sure we understand what the cons are so that we'll be ready with what the pros are as well, and we'll be able to keep our momentum going, you know?
yeah. So Kamala was born in Berkeley. Her father is Jamaican, and she is estranged from her father, never mentions him. Her mother is of Indian descent, and the parents divorced when she was about 7. And at one point, her mother moved to Montreal. The mom and dad were both college professors. Dad was a Marxist economics professor at Stanford, of all places. But the kids, the two girls, stayed with their mother. And one of the points that I've already seen from Trump-leaning opposition researchers is that the mother taught for a period of time in Montreal. And Kamala and her sister went to high school there. And Kamala started college at a small school in Montreal before she completed her undergraduate work at Howard University, the Black college in Washington, D.C. And then she got her law degree from the University of California. It used to be called Hastings. It's now just called UC Law San Francisco. And the other thing that is part of her history is that she did not pass the bar exam the first time. And Trump has been trying to make hay with that. And all I can tell you is the California bar is extremely difficult. In the time when she was taking it, the pass rate was about 60%. And so to her credit, she kept trying, and she ultimately did pass. So she became a line prosecutor in the district attorney's office in Oakland. And you're going to hear about this, then you're going to hear about her work as the DA in San Francisco. And the right is also going to point out that her ambitions were elevated by a guy named Willie Brown. And Willie Brown was 30 years her senior. They dated for, I believe, a couple of years before he'd been the Speaker of the California Assembly representing San Francisco. And then he was termed out, and so he ran for mayor of San Francisco. And they broke up sometime before he ran for mayor. And it doesn't bother me. They had a personal relationship. He did give her a cushy job on the California Board of Unemployment Appeals, which is usually a place where Willie would park legislators who had lost their seats. So that was a leg up that she got. And then he championed her desire to run for DA. It was a 3-way race where she defeated the incumbent, Terrence Hallinan, of the legendary defense lawyer family here in San Francisco, and also a third candidate who was more conservative named Vic Fazio. And so as the DA, there were some good things and some bad things. She pledged during the campaign that she would not seek the death penalty. That's something that I applaud. And she did not. Even when one of the first felony murder cases that came to her office was, it was a case that resulted in the death of a police officer. And even Dianne Feinstein, who nobody ever mistook for a liberal, called her out at the funeral of this policeman. She stood her ground and she convicted the killer, but did not seek the death penalty. But to offset that, she would give a pass to crimes committed by police officers. And so there were a number of cases where she did not prosecute people with a badge who, in my view, should have been prosecuted. I wouldn't prejudge their guilt, but the cases were strong enough that I don't think she should have ducked them.
Understood. As I understand it, one of the reasons she gave specifically for resisting Feinstein, and I think it was at the time the California Attorney General was also piling on her for that death penalty against the police death, the person who committed the police death. As I understood it, one of the reasons she gave publicly was that she said that she was well aware that the death penalty far too often is used disproportionately against poor people and people of color. So at least when I heard that part, at least it struck to me that at least she had that much in mind as like a priority.
Yeah. So she also, in my view, was fairly heavy-handed in some of the prosecutions that she presided over as district attorney. And the one that still galls me is a man named Jamal Truelove. He was a budding rapper. He lived in the projects in San Francisco. He was falsely accused of murdering a friend of his, and he would not snitch on the actual shooter in this case. So Harris, she wasn't the courtroom attorney, but she selected her deputy who handled the case, convicted Truelove. He got a 50 to life sentence. And on appeal, the Court of Appeals just issued a blistering judgment, essentially indicting the DA's office for prosecutor misconduct. And they called it egregious prosecutor misconduct. They said that the prosecuting attorney made I was going to cuss here, but made stuff up and actually lied repeatedly to the jury in closing comments. So the Truelove conviction was set for a retrial. He was acquitted on the second trial when they were not able to use lies and deception. He won a $14 million judgment for his wrongful conviction. And to this day, Kamala Harris has never acknowledged that or apologized to Jamal Truelove. Now, to Truelove's credit, in 2020, he was a guest on The Breakfast Club with Charlemagne the God, and he endorsed the Biden-Harris ticket. He said, even though she's not big enough to apologize to me, he said, I'm big enough to know that Trump is a bigger threat than Biden and Harris. So that's one of the things I invoke when people say, well, how can you support Kamala after you criticize her? Well, ask Jamal.
I was about to say, if Jamal Truelove can, then I don't know how much beef any of the rest of us can have with her, right?
Yeah.
At least enough to withhold our electoral support. So again, ladies and gentlemen, we're here with Peter B. Collins. Peter, as he mentioned, is a longtime veteran of the broadcast industry, and of course, being a resident of California and having many, many years background of political talk programming there, has definitely been keeping tabs on Kamala Harris throughout the years. So, Peter, after the district attorney of the San Francisco area that she was, she moved on to become the Attorney General of California, correct?
Yes, and in that first race, it's the only time she came close to losing. She ran against the district attorney from Los Angeles, a very conservative guy, and I believe it was a 2-point margin. And then she handily won re-election to a second term. So Aldous, as the Attorney General, one of her best-known achievements is that she initially rejected the multi-state settlement with banks who had defrauded mortgage holders in the foreclosure wave that followed the 2008 mortgage meltdown. And she even drew compliments from Obama, who made some kind of sexist remarks about how good looking she is. Uh, and so she deserves a lot of credit because she handled that with some aplomb. It required coordination, not only with the banks and the fraudulent individuals who ran them, but also with the various attorneys general of both parties from across the country. I think 20 states or more were involved in this settlement. So she gets very high marks for that. But there's a flip side to that coin. You remember Steve Mnuchin?
Yes.
Steve Mnuchin was Trump's Treasury Secretary in the first term.
Right, yeah.
And he's a bankster, greedster, slick kind of a guy. Well, he was running a bank called One West in Southern California. He was the CEO. And they were found to have routinely broken the law in foreclosing homes in 2009 and 2010 while she was the attorney general. And her investigators and her line attorneys sat her down and they made the case against Steve Mnuchin. They were all unanimous that he should be prosecuted. And we don't know why to this day, but Kamala Harris said no. Now, he had made one contribution to her campaign, but it was $1,000 or $2,000. It's not like he had
nothing outlandish. Yeah.
Yeah. So that one still sticks with me. Overall, she was, beyond the mortgage issues, she was a fairly run-of-the-mill attorney general. There are a few controversies. She was not supportive of marijuana legalization, which Gavin Newsom, our current governor, championed. He ran a task force that wrote the law to build on medical marijuana to make what we call adult use or recreational marijuana legal in California.
Right.
So this is where I always felt she was more ambitious than experienced. And so as we approached the time when Barbara Boxer announced that she was going to retire from the U.S. Senate, there was a bit of a scramble because Gavin Newsom was the lieutenant governor under Jerry Brown, and Jerry Brown wouldn't even talk to him. He just said, Gavin, when I leave the state, you can sit in my chair, but don't expect to do anything while I'm governor. So he, was looking at other opportunities, but his campaign manager, a guy named Ace Smith, was also the campaign manager for Kamala Harris. So there was a meeting between Kamala and Gavin, hosted by Ace Smith, and they made a deal that Gavin would run for governor and Kamala would run for the Senate. And of course, I don't think Gavin had any idea that, only 2 years into a 6-year Senate term, that Kamala would run for president. So they are friendly rivals.
Right.
And as we looked at the idea of helping Biden get out of the race, Gavin Newsom was busy circling the country, debating Ron DeSantis on Sean Hannity's Fox News show. He spent money, his political money, in both Texas and Florida, dinging Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis on various issues. And he became a leading surrogate for Joe Biden. And it seemed like his calculation was, well, Biden may not make it, so I'm just going to love him to death. And if he does step out, then I might be drafted by the convention. So one of the reasons that Kamala grabbed that ring, as I described it a few minutes ago, was to preclude any possibility that Newsom could gather enough support to present any challenge. And she also successfully got any potential challenger to endorse her in the 24 hours after Biden announced. So I'll just say briefly, her term in the Senate was uneventful. She did not define herself on foreign policy. We still don't know a lot about detailed positions that she holds on both foreign and domestic issues. We know what she said when she ran for president, but since then, the position of vice president really didn't allow her to take any positions different from Joe Biden. So, with that said, the high points were when she made Jeff Sessions nervous during his confirmation hearing by peppering him with questions. And then she did a similar number on Bill Barr when he succeeded Sessions as Trump's attorney general. But beyond that, there's no major legislation, nothing that she really did as a senator that you can say, oh, that qualifies her to be president. So as vice president, I cringed during the first month or two when she was not made a border czar. Okay, that's
Right.
a concoction of the Trump message machine.
Right.
But she was sent by Biden to the triangle of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And it really pained me to see the daughter of immigrants tell people in those impoverished countries, don't come to the United States. And, nominally she was there to spread money around, which would improve the economies in those countries, which would reduce pressure on migration to the U.S.
Which is not a bad idea, but...
Right. But it takes time. And It's not like it fixed things in a measurable way. And one of my big beefs of both the Obama and Trump and not both, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations has to do with Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have crushed that country's economy in order to squeeze out a guy because he's a socialist. And Maduro has become increasingly authoritarian because he's had to respond to direct coup attempts from the United States. And I don't, condone the kind of, he has his own version of Haiti's Tonton Macoute, these thugs who are enforcers on the streets of Caracas. But fundamentally, the 2018 election was not rigged. And the U.S. media has joined with Elliot Abrams, who's got so much Central American blood on his hands that Trump brought him back into government. And John Bolton was the other player. And they decided just to, even though they were given advice that more sanctions on Venezuela would lead to outmigration that would be heading primarily for the United States. And so the failure of the Biden team and, by implication, Kamala Harris, to address that and also to reverse Trump's reversal of Obama's opening to Cuba, which I thought was one of his signature foreign policy achievements. So, that leaves us with where we are today. And Aldous, you picked a good day to invite me on your show because the vice president announced that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is her running mate.
Yes, indeed.
And again, if we'd had an open convention, there might have been more of a talent parade or at least some speed dating to identify who the strongest candidate would be.
She didn't even ask me.
and you ran for president.
See,
Yeah, you've got that qualification, and I don't. All this,
I actually made it onto one ballot.
Yeah.
So anyway,
well, so I'm actually relieved because I could have accepted Walz or Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, but I was opposed to Josh Shapiro.
Yeah.
And it pains me to see advocates from the Jewish community who hold down jobs in the commentariat, and I'm specifically talking about Jake Tapper and his companions at CNN. They tried to make it seem like there was an anti-Semitic effort to keep Josh Shapiro off the ticket. And there is a serious policy issue related to Israel and Shapiro's support for Israel that was at the center of those who opposed to adding him as VP. But that was spun as anti-Semitism. And I am so offended by the casual weaponized use of anti-Semitism that has been widespread in this country since last October 7th.
Yes, indeed.
And the idea that people who can't stand Netanyahu, who are deeply and morally offended by the tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians who have been killed so that he can pretend to wipe out Hamas, it's really deeply, deeply troubling. And so when Jake Tapper and others said, well, gosh, Josh Shapiro's position on Israel isn't any different than the other candidates. That's not true.
No.
Shapiro is openly and aggressively supporting Israeli militarism and the U.S. funding of it. And he publicly endorsed the firing of the president of the University of Pennsylvania and squelched the campus protests that came out of a concern for humanitarian values, not some kind of support for Hamas.
Oh, exactly.
Like in so many other cases, they found a handful of people who, talked about their support for Hamas or who supported the Intifada or the trope, which is subjective depending on who's hearing it, of the phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And so to see Shapiro deselected, I think is a wise move on Harris's part. And it gives a shot at bringing back Democratic voters in Michigan who would not have supported Biden.
No. Here's the other thing, too, is that from all reports, it came down to Shapiro or Walz, as far as like those were like the two people she was really looking at within the last 24 hours before the announcement was made. And that apparently the decision was made like not long before it was announced that, okay, this is where we're going. That apparently she slept on it, and then on Tuesday, made the announcement. And to me, in a lot of ways, this is the first real test of her own judgment about where she wants her administration to be pointed toward. And I found that really instructive, because with Shapiro, it's a centrist, a pro-Israel, and definitely a much more conservative bent than, say, Walz, from what I could see, in a lot of ways. And so to me, it was like, okay, this is a good sign. This shows that at the very least, when she's the person who's going to be in charge of what's happening, she's going to be basically going and erring, if there is any error to be made, on the side of the progressive end of things. At least that's what it looked like to me.
Domestically, I agree. And, Walz is already being painted as, coupling with Kamala to become the most, leftist team ever to run for office in this country. That would have happened to anybody. Shapiro would have been called a San Francisco liberal.
I know it's amusing because it's like, well, because of his background, Walz is being painted as a wannabe San Franciscan, and I'm like, they would have said that about Shapiro too. The right wing noise machine calls anybody who isn't a Republican a socialist, and they'll lay that on a Republican if they get too close to center. So
I want to share my biggest concern right now, which relates to Israel. Mm-hmm. And that is that and let me just briefly recap this. Republican leaders invited Netanyahu to come to Washington.
Yes.
Back in 2016, it was Netanyahu and Israel who offered the real foreign interference in our presidential election. And
yeah, right.
the speaker and Trump tried to set up a trap, and it appears they were successful. So Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, who are both in the pocket of AIPAC, those are the biggest money they receive is from Israeli allies in this country. They went along with it. So Bibi comes, gets a joint session of Congress. He speaks. He, is adamant that Israel's going to win, and he ignores the hostage issue. He ignores the calls for a ceasefire. Then he meets with Biden. We don't really know much about that meeting. Then he met separately with Harris, and Netanyahu has these crocodile tears that in their private meeting, she didn't say anything about a ceasefire. And then she came out and told the media that she wants a ceasefire now. So that was the first point where she diverged from the administration line. And I'm happy to see that. But then Netanyahu went to Mar-a-Lago. 3 days later, he launches an assassination spree of the Hezbollah leader in Lebanon and of the Hamas leader who was attending the inauguration of the new president of Iran.
In Tehran.
In Tehran.
Yeah.
Now, this follows the April event where Netanyahu bombed and killed a top Iranian general in Syria. It led to what I call the Saturday night fireworks show. Iran launched 300 missiles and drones over Israeli airspace, but it's clear that they didn't intend any significant damage. A single person, a child, was killed, and it appears that that may have been from the debris from an Iron Dome missile, not from the Iranian assault.
Right, right.
So Netanyahu has been provoking Iran for months now. He has wanted the U.S. to join him in a war with Iran for years now, and he's closer to it than ever before. And let me acknowledge that my advocacy for Biden to step down has a downside. He is now a lame duck. And, he wasn't getting very far when he poked his finger at Netanyahu anyway. But now Netanyahu doesn't even have to return his phone calls, and he knows that the bombs and the money will continue to flow. So the biggest risk I see is that the October surprise could be an Iranian-Israeli war that the U.S. feels compelled to get involved with. And this could derail the possibility of a Harris-Walz ticket and Democrats' down ticket if we end up at war and Trump is there saying, as he always says, it never would have happened if I was president.
Oh, yes. I would have handled that differently. Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah. So that, Tim Walz can handle the attacks on him as too liberal. I mean, he's a former NRA member. He had a moderate voting record when he spent 6 terms in Congress. 6 years, maybe, not 6 terms.
No, 12 years. It was 12 years in Congress.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
The other thing that we're going to see is that Walz will, unfortunately, revive the woke wedge. We're going to replay the George Floyd protests, and Trump is going to talk about carnage on the streets of America when we know that 94% of the BLM protests were entirely peaceful, and that the so-called defund the police movement was a case of some of the most effective demagoguery that Trump has imposed on us, where he turned defund the police and the term woke into these pejoratives that cause the white racists in our country to just nod. And Bill Maher eggs them on, His show this year, I only counted one show where he didn't have a guest who was against wokeness.
Yeah.
And so that has been defined to represent the most extreme elements. Likewise, there were only two police departments that I know of that shifted major funding, Minneapolis and Seattle. And all of that has been restored. And the whole movement to effect a criminal justice reform in this country was completely tabled by the Democrats. And they were afraid of the demagogue that Trump became. So to me, the biggest threats to Harris and Walz are the replay of 2020. It'll now allow the media and the Republicans to avoid any criticism for Trump's mishandling of COVID. They're going to focus on, a few incidents where Black people threatened white people and make that seem like it happened every day all over the country. And then, as I said, the issues with Israel and the risk of a war with Iran, I think are very significant.
Yeah. Oh, indeed. And it's especially more likely to be a problem given, as you said, that Bibi Netanyahu went to Mar-a-Lago just a couple days after he was in D.C. and had a fairly extensive amount of time with Trump. So, it's one of those things where history shows us that there is no small amount of times where you will find a candidate for president or such collaborating with outside international forces to try to make things better or worse for him. Reagan in the Iran hostage crisis comes immediately to mind. So, yeah. Mm.
Well, and it only surfaced this week, but there are pretty credible allegations that Trump took $10 million in cash from the military dictator of Egypt. And he apparently got signals that the money was coming before the election. And just before the election, he loaned his campaign $10 million, the exact same number. And then the cash was delivered shortly after the inauguration. And the investigation was squelched by Bill Barr.
Right. Well, so these are definitely things to look out for. What would you say to people who are looking at Kamala Harris and wondering exactly what it is they should be touting about her to those who have doubts?
Well, I think that she is a very smart and capable woman. And I think that she has managed her rise to power pretty well. She plays hardball with the best of the white boys who have their pads on and play, every day. I think that she does know how to read a room, and she knows how to read the mood of the country and the political base that she is appealing to. Again, to me, the things we have a lot of, as Rummy would tell us, known unknowns. We don't know currently where she stands. It appears she's going to flip on fracking in order to appeal to voters in Pennsylvania. And I'd like to see a poll, Aldous, to see if Democrats in Pennsylvania still support fracking. I find that hard to believe. Though
it really does sound weird, especially considering when she was Attorney General of California, she was very strong. She very strongly joined, I believe it was a lawsuit against big oil at the time. So that's one of the few indicators we have where she about policy stances she's taken on the environment that I've seen, at least.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And I think that she, the one thing that in her, and it's only been 2 weeks, right?
Right.
But she has in her stump speech talked about price gouging as a part of the inflation cycle. And this is one of the biggest missed opportunities that I would put at the feet of Joe Biden. And I think it's because he's from Delaware, the corporate headquarters, and he doesn't like to attack his friends.
Right.
But we had a wave of inflation. They want to blame it on the COVID money that was passed out. But it began with the increase in gasoline prices that came from the sanctions on Russia that impacted the world market. And then it spiraled upward. And you'll notice that corporate profits have not taken a hit from inflation.
Oh, no, not at all.
They just keep raising prices, irrespective of what their costs are. And so, we just saw that finally the court issued its decision in the antitrust case against Google, declaring it a monopoly. That's been apparent to anybody who looked at the numbers of search dominance of the last 20 years. That'll be fought out in the courts and certainly go to the Supreme Court. But it is a signal that she can embrace and say, Google's done some good things. But when it becomes a monopoly, when you are engaged in restraint of trade, that is against the law. And that's where her role as a prosecutor can be helpful, even on issues like inflation. And I think that she needs to really get a handle on that and find a way to get Waltz also to echo it. Because, I'm a lucky guy, okay? I can go to the grocery store without a budget, and I can get whatever I want, and whatever it costs, I pay for it. But I see the people in my supermarket who take something off the shelf or out of the freezer, and then they put it back. And there's no question that the cost of living has really hurt a lot of Americans in ways that don't show up in the data. And they are ripe for Trump, who has said, without offering any real solid plan, that, when I become president, prices are going to go down. Come on.
That's somehow he's going to magically solve inflation. Yeah.
Prices never go down.
No.
That is a big lie. Yet people want to believe it. And because they're fed right-wing propaganda by talk radio and cable news every day of the week, they are predisposed to believe that Democrats caused it. And, we're seeing the market crash that occurred on Monday of this week. And that's because the Fed has been keeping interest rates up until they saw employment levels level off or drop. That's been their goal all along.
Oh, yes.
And the job market resisted that. It just kept growing despite the efforts of the Fed. Well, they've got their blood. They've got people who are losing their jobs. Companies are trimming employment, and job seekers are taking longer to find a new job as the actual unemployment rate is going up slightly. So come on, Fed, get your boot off our windpipe.
No kidding.
Before the election.
That would be nice. And given that, Biden, while he may be a quote-unquote lame duck, is still technically in charge of a lot of this, he could try to make things at least slightly more favorable for his heir apparent. In any case, Peter, I want to thank you so much for coming on board here and shedding some light on the whole situation, because this is a lot of stuff that we went over that's just not being made clear anywhere else. And as always, I try to be the cure for the common media with this program. I want to make sure that people have a chance to actually be exposed to this information. So I really appreciate you coming on board and giving us these perspectives.
Well, Aldous, I love your show, and I'm always glad to be with you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Peter. And you've been listening to TMI with Aldous Tyler. We'll be right back.